the big elephant in the room these days when it comes to the state is financing, specifically property taxes.
Sure.
The schools make up a big component of that. What do you hope as the NSCA would see that comes out of the legislature next year? Because it's something that they're going to be working on yet again.
Right. Every year we work on property tax relief, and every year we leave a lot of things on the table. And what happens is there's a lot of good ideas that then are left on the table. And what we hope this year is those good ideas come forward earlier in the session, and that we can really have a lot of conversation around the needs of a lot of different districts and what property tax looks like for those districts, and how then we can look at that three-legged stool of property, sales, and income tax and make that three-legged stool a little more balanced without blowing a hole in anyone's budget by doing it.
What are some of those ideas that have cropped up in the past to potentially help the situation, but maybe have been too late in the game to be really considered?
Well, everyone has, you say game, but everyone has their own ideas of what would be, a good way to, you have to have revenue, right? So if you're going to take away property tax income, then you're going to have some other way to generate revenue. So we look at corporate tax structure. We look at things that aren't currently taxed that may need to be taxed, maybe some services. We look at things that are across the board, sales or income tax or services that may need to be looked at to generate some other revenue to lower that property tax reliance. And so when you look at those things and they're laying those things out on the table, you have certain entities that are really interested in certain things, right? So you have agriculture that's interested, you have business that's interested, you have corporate tax structure that's interested. But what you have to do is find a way to have everyone have their own piece of the pie, but also be able to compromise and give so that it is an equitable distribution of those tax dollars.
Speaking of the equitable part, of course, TIOSA, a big part of
exactly.
When it comes to deciding where the equalization funding.
Right.
But there are a number of school districts that, depending on where they are and what their tax base is, they don't see anything from the state whatsoever.
A large number. So that right there is a huge problem, right? Because if you look at Nebraska, we're about, depending on where you look, which numbers you look at, we're about 47th or 48th in the nation for state aid to schools. So if you're looking at that, and you're looking at 178 or so school districts that receive no equalization aid, then they're only reliant on property taxes unless they're getting equalization for maybe special education or for title funding through the state. So, but a majority of what they're doing for funding their schools is through property taxes. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a balance. There has to be a way to figure out, again, without blowing a hole in that budget, how do you then generate the revenue that will help equalize? They have looked at across the board of saying, okay, what if we give every school district or every student a base amount from the state? But again, where do you get that money from? Because you have to decide, how do you get the property taxes to be down by generating the income? So they're looking at like an equalization of students. So it depends on what you're looking at. I mean, there were probably 3 or 4 different bills on the table last year that either didn't get out of committee or didn't get debated on the floor. And we work with, at the Nebraska State Education Association, we are in a bunch of coalitions, so we sit down and we say, all right, what does it look like for Farm Bureau? What does it look like for Farmers Union? What does it look like for the soybean farmers and the, there's different organizations, Nebraskans United. We sit at the table with folks and say, yes, we understand your needs and we understand your needs. Now, what can we do to compromise? And I think that sometimes that's the problem, is that we just never get past that. So there's just going to have to be some things that we talk about. The chamber, there's a property tax petition right now that would say, okay, you get 35% of your property taxes back in a refund in your income tax.
Yep.
Well, that blows, a huge hole in the budget then, because then how do you replace those dollars that were income tax dollars or property tax dollars, right? Then you have a $1 billion hole in the budget for that. And that property tax initiative, it doesn't say how do you replace that. They say, well, that's the legislative, that's their job.
And that's kind of the point.
Right.
That's kind of the point of the whole petition drive.
Right.
Talking to the organizers is that over the course of time, there have been so many different changes to Nebraska's tax structure, specifically regarding property tax, that these fixes that we've attempted to do, including TIOSA, the current form of TIOSA, just haven't worked. Property taxes continue to rise. And so basically, I don't necessarily want to call it a revolt, if you will, but perhaps that's the best way to put it, similar to Prop 13 in California, in that, we're going to make you fix it. This is how we're going to do it. And then the people are going to force that kind of sort of Damocles, I guess, over the head of the legislature to maybe knuckle down and figure some of this stuff out.
Unfortunately, when they've done that in other states, our surrounding states that have done some, tax reform kind of things like that, where they say this is the way, it still doesn't happen. And then you end up in a worse situation because it doesn't happen. So I have faith, that we really need to say, we elected these 49 folks to go to Lincoln and to sit down and do that. And what we need to do then is to get involved, right? Mm-hmm. If you are a taxpayer, if you are a stakeholder in this, which we all are, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you rent your home or not, you're still a taxpayer involved in this. And you have to then say what's important to you. Public schools are important to the state of Nebraska. That is a given. Mm-hmm. I put 80,000 miles on my car in the last 2.5 years driving around Nebraska, visiting with people all across Nebraska. And everywhere I go, I hear that it is important to keep the community schools. It is important. 90% of the kids in Nebraska go to public schools. It is important to us. It is important to us that a kid that goes to school in Hyannis has the same quality public education and opportunities as a kid that goes to school in a larger district. So how do we do that? And how do we say that it is important to us? And how do we do that without putting a burden on other people? Mm-hmm. And that's where we're at. And that's why we as Nebraskans are very unique in this country, as that we believe in local control and we believe in each other. Mm-hmm. And I really truly believe we can figure this out. I think there's some good bills that were left on the table last year, and I think that we can do this.
Shift gears a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about behavioral and mental health when it comes to students and in the classroom. Right. We've seen a lot more integration as time has gone on of students who may not, say, 15, 20 years ago, may not have been integrated into the regular classroom, right. Those who may be facing certain levels of developmental disabilities. Explain the importance of being able to address some of these issues in the classroom with the assistance of the community.
Well, I have taught special ed for 32 years, so I'm very familiar with this situation. And I also am very knowledgeable about listening to community members and what's out there. NSEA is very focused of working with our legislators and also working with community groups. We have a lot of great nonprofits that are working together to try to meet the needs. However, when you're looking at rural communities too, there's not a lot of services out there.
Sure.
And so you are looking at school districts to provide all these services, and they just don't have the resources to do that. And so we have recently got a large grant from the National Education Association. In the spring, we're going to go around the state and we're going to have these conversations. And we're going to sit down and we're going to come out with an action plan that says, how can we develop these services so that we're not all like splintered in these services and these approaches. We also are asking our members and our teachers out there to kind of tell us what's going on. So we have a survey out right now where they can put in information. And we're working with Senator Groney on a discipline bill that is looking at not just about how do we, deal with the real aggressive behaviors or the violent behaviors, but how do we deal with the root of behaviors and meet the needs of these kids? Because they are needing more and more services. And you're right. Back when I started in special education, we had more self-contained classrooms, and we don't have the amount of resources. And we expect that all children are able to receive what they need. And what they need may not be in their regular classroom. It may be in a self-contained classroom. It may be with different services. But every child deserves the opportunity to learn. And we want to make sure that we understand what that is and what that looks like. And the only way we can do that is to talk to people, to develop those relationships, to work with our administrators and our community and say, how can we do this? Because we talk a lot about prison reform. And to me, we're looking at the wrong end, right? We need to look at the other end and say, what can we do on the other end to say, how can we provide these services for kids and help them to be better citizens so that when we're investing in them, that they are not ending up in this pipeline going straight into a correctional facility. So if we don't look at that it's all of our problem, that it's all of our solution, and that's what we need to look at is solutions, problem solving, and really looking at it that kids are 24% of our population, but they're 100% of our future. And we need to really continue to look at it that way so that we can really make Nebraska continue to be this great state that I was raised in and that we want our kids to do.
When it comes to services, obviously money is always the driving factor in those things. Of course, we have the ESUs throughout the state, and I know here locally they are very keen on helping provide those services for those districts who cannot and probably even wouldn't be able to, with the NSCA's assistance, be able to afford those services themselves. Have you been working with the ESUs as well to help with developing these and making these things available?
Sure, and I know that Senator Erdman brought forth a bill on the panhandle, like behavioral health. So making sure that even though you're spread out, that you are still having the ability to say, even if we have some students that need some services, how do we work with ESUs? How do we have behavioral specialists? How do we have therapists, psychologists? And where do those come from? And then how do we use technology? Right? We have this ability now to say, hey, if we can't get to someone, how can we use technology also to help with some of those services as well, if you can't directly get to someone to provide those services? And for families, there's a lot of things going on in families. They're working 2 and 3 jobs. How do you do that if you can't actually get in the car and drive a kid to an appointment for counseling or those kind of services? We're also providing a lot of professional development, helping our teachers be more trained in how to deal with these situations, how to deal with kids that are coming from trauma or from poverty. How do you work better with these students? How do you help them be better students and be better at handling situations?
You mentioned technology, and I guess it kind of begs the question, is it maybe time to rethink a little bit the classroom, if you will, and integrate technology even more? The example that I can think of is UNMC providing their teleservices and long distance teaching to students out here at WNCC at the Harm Center. Being able to leverage those types of things so districts can provide these services to the students. But then again, you also lose out potentially on that individual contact one-on-one, at least in person.
So we have through the Department of Ed, we have what's called Blend Ed. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So we're really working on that technology piece as well as keeping that human contact. How do we do that in a way that you keep a teacher in the classroom, but you're also providing those extra services for especially for kids too that may say, for example, we're working really a lot of career tech ed, right? And you don't have maybe the ability to have all of these different resources. Community colleges are a perfect example of being able to offer those things across the state through a blend ed, through a distance learning kind of thing. And now, used to be you had to have like all this technology to do that. Now you need a laptop, literally, or an iPad. So you're able to do, more hands-on things. And I'm hearing that more and more as I'm going across the state. I worked in the Career Academy in Lincoln. We had a bunch of different pathways for kids. And as I go across the state, teaching for one is one that we're really working on. How do we grow our own teachers? How do we help high school students go into teaching? And we have a huge Educator Rising program that's growing through the state. Welding. I just talked to a teacher last night in Alliance where they're doing certification in high school for welders because that is such a field that's needed. Certification in Microsoft Office, certification in CNA while they're high schoolers, so that if they go on to college, they have something they can use as they're going to college, or that they're already certified in welding, they could get an AA, they could, move on to something else. So I think we're looking at career readiness as well as college readiness. And I think manufacturing, they are begging for skilled workers everywhere. And I heard that when I was out here last year touring and looking at ag and the shortage of ag workers, the shortage even at the, the factories here for the sugar factory and for, the bean factory. There still need skilled workers for these things. So I think distance learning is one of those things that we can work with because we have great colleges in Nebraska. We have great community colleges. So I am all about, and I think NSCA is all about looking at what works best. Just because we did something the same way for all these years, it doesn't matter. It's not the right way, because just like everything changes, and we need to look at things and say what works best for these kids in this community. And I think that's what's great about Nebraska. What works great in Alliance may not work great in Tryon. You have to look at what you have and then make that work for your community and for your students.
And have we kind of moved beyond the idea that everybody has to go to college necessarily then? Because certainly bringing the Career Academy experience into the high school level kind of harkens back to the old vocational education days, which kind of died off there for a while in the 90s and the early 2000s, de-emphasized in favor of higher education, the 2- and 4-year institutions. But now we're starting to see that especially the 2-year institutions, some of that training coming right down into the career academies.
Right. So I think like the Career Academy in Lincoln where I worked, it was a half and half. So we had welding, construction, culinary, manufacturing, but we had IT and education and nursing and so it was like a mix. So you have more opportunities for kids. I look at my 16-year-old grandson who has absolutely no desire at this point in his life to go to college. He has an absolute desire to be an auto mechanic, right? And I have the absolute desire to help him do that. Because I am not one who is going to say to him, that is your only path, right? Your path is what your passion is. And if I don't help him be the best he can be at what he wants to do, he's not going to be successful if I push him into something else. So he still has to do his classwork, which
of course.
We have that conversation frequently. However, that doesn't mean that that's his only path.
Sure.
And so I think the earlier we get kids to understand that you have many opportunities, but this is the path that you might have to do to graduate from high school, but you also have this path that you could maybe, I taught in Texas 30 years ago. The high school kids in Texas were graduating 30 years ago with degrees in cosmetology. They could walk out as an 18-year-old, walk into a beauty shop and be cutting hair, or a degree in culinary. That was 30 years ago. And you're right, everything in education kind of comes full circle. And I'm really excited about the fact that we aren't just looking at this cookie cutter approach. And, when you look at other countries, you look at China, for example, their kids are told, this is your path, right? I don't like that. You have an individual and you have a kid that says, this is my path. And trust me, some of those kids are going to make a whole lot more money than some of the other, right? My welders that did very well at welding. I had kids that were welders that needed special education services, but they were the best welders that they had in those classes. And they're going to be very successful as welders. So I think we just look at kids as individuals, and I think that's what we need to do in education as well. And say our kids have so much potential, and if we want them to stay in Nebraska and be part of the communities and stay in our rural communities, then we need to help them do that.
And that's something that's very difficult to do. Well, it's always been very difficult, even when I was a youngster growing up out here in the 70s and 80s. Boy, the allure of the big lights, the big city, make that siren call very attractive when you are 18, 19, 20, 22. But the schools, obviously, with some of these apprenticeship programs, and again the career academies and the internships that are now available, certainly make it more attractive to homegrown talent to stick around, or at least come back after they've completed some training and maybe some of their career.
I went to Mid-Plains in North Platte when I graduated from high school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And now I look at Mid-Plains, I've been there, I met with the president, I meet with people there, which is just amazing to me that that's what I do now. However, my friend is now she goes out to all the high schools and talks to kids about this exact same thing. About, what do you want to do? What can we do for you at Mid-Plains Community College, And there are tons of opportunities at Mid-Plains, at Curtis, at the Ag School, and so whether you want to go, you could go there for a year. I mean, even welding at Southeast Community College, you can have a certificate, you can have an associate's, you can get a 4-year degree. You can become an underwater welder and make $200,000 a year. Now, that doesn't sound any fun to me. However, 200 grand, that's something you might want to do for a few years.
Sure.
At Southeast Community College, you can do destructive design where you go in and test like airplanes and bridges. They make 150 grand, and it's an 18-month program.
Yeah, and they get to be a mythbuster, destroy things.
They do, and they get to travel all over. I had this kid that was a busser at Missy's when I worked there, my second job as a teacher, and he was like a high school student. And, I would call, as my father would say, a knucklehead. He was a friend. I was older, and that's what he ended up doing. And bought a BMW when he was 24 years old, traveled all over the country, and that's still what he does. He's a destructive, he goes in and tests bridges and skyscrapers and all sorts of stuff for that. 18 months. Yeah. So anything's possible. We believe that as teachers and as NSCA. I love my job, but I really love Nebraska. And I can't think of a better thing to do than travel around and talk to people.